Hi everyone, my name's Eric. I'm on the Omni Analytics team, and I wanted to present to you the work we did, which we're calling Swimmers, Surfers, and Suntanners. Basically, an exploratory analysis and profiling analysis of PoolTogether version 4. So, excited to show you what we've got today. So let's start by saying, for those of you who don't know, what is PoolTogether and why are we pooling together? So you can think of PoolTogether as a prize-linked savings account. The idea is you transfer your crypto into a shared pool. You're entered basically with a chance to win a drawing, and the deposits give the player a chance to win an award, and it's proportional to the amount of the pool their deposits claim. And what's cool is, like traditional savings accounts, the money in that pool earns a yield, and each user, of course, can withdraw at their own discretion. Lots of money in terms of prizes has been awarded at the time of this writing. Over 2.6 million USD, as a matter of fact, have been awarded through PoolTogether version 4. You can participate in it on Ethereum, Avalanche, Polygon, and Optimism. So lots of choices of the chain depending on what you want to participate in. Okay, so how did we go about doing this analysis? So it all started with Dr. CPU's PoolTogether repo, which we're providing the link here. You can see a little screenshot of it at the right. Basically, there's a series of SQL data dumps, and we loaded all of them into a single database. And then we extracted the relevant tables from it as CSV files that we could process in our preferred language, R and R Studio. So effectively what we're looking at is on-chain debank data. So for each of the wallet addresses found within the data dump, we use the debank API to pull characteristics about them. It's a cross-chain protocol, remember, so we sort of had to collect information about wallet balance, tokens held, transaction activity, and we had to do this across all the chains available. And then we stored the relevant statistics for each of the chains, including Ethereum, Polygon, and Avalanche. So you can see a little screenshot of the data right below once we were done processing that. Okay, and then ultimately we created what we're really thinking of as like a player's play history within the SQL database. And we created that data set with the following columns. So again, remember, this is all with respect to the chain that we're analyzing. So there's a lot more columns than you just see here because it's all per chain. But effectively, we're tracking the time since the first round played, the total number of rounds, the total number of wins, the amount that was claimable that the player could have claimed, the amount that was dropped because there's a limit, and then, the staking, basically the amount staked across all rounds, the first round and the last round. That's from the data set. And then we also derived the following variables, which is, again, age in days. So the time since the wallet address was first used across any chain, the number of chains the address had in use, the number of tokens across all chains, and the total USD across all chains. So basically an aggregation across the different chains. The data set is recent as of July 27, so brand new. But of course, the data is updating all the time, so we can continue to rerun this analysis into the future. Here's just a little screenshot of the data. You can see a lot of zeros, meaning, in some cases, people weren't necessarily, getting involved in the staking and taking rewards. Maybe they just joined the platform, did a little bit, or on a particular chain. Like in this case, we see a lot of Polygon and not so much on Avalanche or Ethereum. But then users, like right in the middle of the screen, you see someone who had balances in Avalanche and Polygon as well. Okay, so here's some quick stats we can look at. So the total number of unique wallets is over 32,000, and that includes 3,000 on Avalanche, 500 on Ethereum, and over 30,000 on Polygon, and then some that appear even on all three, 32 that appeared on all three. Okay, so let's take a look at our first analysis, a cross-chain player behavior analysis. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to better understand player behavior, and we're doing that by looking at a number of factors: traffic, deposits, churn, and rewards effectively. So let's look at player traffic over time. Basically, this is the number of players over time across the various chains. So you can see at the top, we've aggregated all chains. In the bottom rows, you see the individual chains for comparison. And remember, Polygon has by far the most number of unique addresses. So the Polygon graph appears quite similarly to the overall graph. What you'll notice here is the green highlights basically new players introduced, the red are the players that are lost, and then we have a little bit of blue for like reconnected players. And I guess the takeaway is, you can see in Ethereum and Polygon, there's a high loss of players recently, which you could probably attribute to the recent crypto crash and the decline in prices. In Polygon in particular, and also in the overall, you can see a really strong signal noted between, say, rounds 158 and 160, as well as rounds 235 to 238, where there's a big spike in new players. As far as deposits go, you can kind of look at this, and again, we aggregated all chains up at the top and then the individual chains at the bottom. It's kind of interesting that in general, the different chains show a pretty different distribution. So across all chains, the peaks tend to shift left, but on Polygon, there's a little bit of a hollowing out of the middle-sized deposits compared to the rest. Whereas with Ethereum, for example, there's multimodal peaks at the start that eventually kind of merge as time passes. So giving you an idea of that the deposit distribution kind of differs across the chains as a function of time. So it's kind of interesting there that it's so different. Here we're looking at the player deposit change round to round between winners and losers. So effectively, we've colored by a winner and a loser and how that causes the change in the deposit to change basically as a function of time. And it's kind of interesting. Like in Ethereum, it seems like if you lose, you tend to increase your balance, and while winners would tend to take their wins cash out, with only a fraction of them depositing like more money in. Whereas in Avalanche, the winners and losers tend to kind of show the same behavior, and in Polygon, it seems more like the winners keep their balance, where they might tend to try again for another round. So again, it's slight. There's different interpretations of these graphs, but it's kind of interesting that when you look at it by chain, there truly is like a perceived and pretty obvious difference in the behavior. Okay, and if we look at churn, effectively what we're looking at here is whether if you're a round loser or winner, whether you tend to churn or whether you tend to stay. And kind of what we see is like in Avalanche, the losers are inclined kind of to churn out. And it's even more pronounced, arguably, in Polygon that you see that. But in Ethereum, players tend to show the opposite pattern, which is really interesting. So in Ethereum, the winners are more inclined to churn out, and in Polygon, the losers are. Kind of tells you like the Ethereum players, at least for the data we have, would tend to take their winnings and churn and decide not to come back, whereas Polygon, maybe they're a little bit more, willing to continue and see what happens. Rewards compared to deposits. So what we looked at here is the dropped amounts, keeping in mind that a user can only claim 2 picks. So if he has more than 2 winning picks, the rest go to the dropped rewards. So Avalanche, it doesn't show much of a change, as you can see in the bottom right. But in Ethereum, what you see is a pretty noticeable decrease in the reward amount. But in Polygon, you see the most drastic, and we suspect that this was because of basically the deposits were spread over more and more accounts, so that the number of players getting more than 2 winning ticks kept dropping. Whereas in Ethereum, because there's fewer accounts, it's more likely that you had more than 2 winning picks effectively. Okay, and here we're looking at rewards drop versus claimable. So Basically, you can think of it like the ratio of claimable to dropped. And you can clearly see, looking at Ethereum first, that it has the most dropped ratio out of all the winning ticks, hovering kind of around 50% as a function of time. And we think it might be due to the high gas prices, so people are less inclined to divide their funds between wallets. Um, it's very clear there's different ranges. So Polygon clearly has the lowest, which tends to hover around 10 to 15%. And that could be attributed to having players with very low deposits. Polygon players, they start from a higher average balance, but they peak to a pretty low average balance. So the winning picks were distributed more evenly as time passed. Okay, and now let's take a look at profiling some of the players that are on the platform. So, what did we do for this? We basically did a cluster analysis where we took some of those statistics that you were looking at earlier and used a lot of different unsupervised learning techniques. We kind of experimented with them. We ultimately settled on K means because it had the most interpretable results. It's also a computationally like less intensive algorithm, which is kind of a nice bonus as well when we're wanting to rerun this frequently with new data. So what we're staring at here, there's a lot going on here, but the first focus to look at is on the left. What we did is we made what's called a parallel coordinate plot of the different cluster averages across four of the variables. So basically the age, the number of chains, the number of tokens, and the total amount of USD in that particular address. And there's four clusters that we've defined, and you can kind of immediately see some of their characteristics, but we've broken them down for you in a table in the bottom right. So for instance, cluster 4, which is that pink magenta kind of color, clearly is highest on both the age of the account and also the total USD balance. You can see that in the parallel coordinate plot. On the flip side, cluster 3, the kind of bluish cluster, you can see is highest on number of chains and number of tokens. In the top right, you see what's called an MDS plot, which is sort of reducing these variables to two-dimensional space and then plotting them to see sort of how that separation looks across the different clusters. And you can kind of see the groupings pretty clearly. Cluster 1, 2, 3, and 4 all sort of fall in their distinct regions within that MDS plot, which is an indication that there is, in fact, a pretty clear delineation of these clusters across the first two principal components. So we tried to interpret them a little bit and give some meaning and context to the clusters. So cluster 1 we're calling the average swimmers. That's the green cluster. They're sort of middle of the road in everything, so that kind of, I guess, is good that they're the first cluster in this instance. It's a middle of the road cluster. There's nothing that really stands out. The other ones are a little bit more interesting. So cluster 2 we're calling the pool paddlers. This is, if you look at the table which we've reproduced on this slide, this is the most common cluster. It also has the lowest values across every single metric, as you can see. It has the smallest average balance, the fewest number of tokens, the fewest number of chains, and the shortest amount of time, which basically implies it's a younger wallet. They've done less activity. They're kind of just getting their feet wet. They're pool paddlers. The surfers, cluster 3, which is that blue cluster we kind of mentioned previously, they are older, but not as old as cluster 4, but they have the highest number of tokens and they're active on the most number of chains. So they're sort of, diversified in terms of their, their activity on the platform. And we're calling them surfers largely because they're really heavily involved, as you can see. It's not common, but they're doing quite a bit of activity on the platform. Cluster 4 is kind of interesting because, as we mentioned, it's the oldest, and it's also the ones with the highest balance. And with respect to their age, we ended up calling them the OG swimmers. They've been active the longest, they have the highest balance. They're also pretty active in terms of number of chains and number of tokens, although not quite as much as the surfers group. So it's kind of cool is even, not that everyone fits neatly into these categories. These categories do tend to do a good job of representing the behaviors that we see by looking at the data on this platform. This is just a little slide that talks about the MDS interpretation, so I'm not going to go too much into it, but the idea basically is that this plot gives us confidence that the variables we've used for the clustering do a good job of separating the groups, and it gives us sort of confidence that these are truly distinct groups on the variables that we're seeing across the profiles. There's a couple other views you can look at the MDS plot with. So we plotted the third principal component against the first and the third against the second. Again, this shows you like a separation. What's kind of interesting on the plot on the right, when you look at PC3 versus PC2, you notice that cluster 2 kind of falls within the bounds a bit of cluster 1. So if we go back to our interpretation, that's the pool paddlers and the average swimmers. Basically what it's suggesting is that a lot of the pool paddlers on some dimension of the data are much like the average swimmers, and that's not a big surprise when you look at the plot. You can see, in general, the average swimmers have higher values across the profiles, but these are just averages. And so what it says is there's a distinct subgroup where they kind of do overlap, at least on some variables, and that's not at all unsurprising given what we're seeing in these plots. Okay, so that was a high-level overview of the analysis we did. Now I want to just briefly mention some, additional analysis we did as an appendix, and basically the idea for some extensions to this work. So first, we did the player profiling by chain, and I just wanted to quickly highlight this. So when we look at Polygon, you'll notice that those clusters, broadly speaking, except for their colors and being a little bit different, appears very similarly to the overall result. That's not a surprise because, as we know, Polygon represents the largest fraction of the addresses that we see in the data. When we look at Avalanche, we actually do see some different results. So, for instance, there's not as clear of a group that is really high in terms of the age. So, for example, cluster 1 in this instance, the green group, would be most comparable to what we're calling the surfer group in the other analysis. But you'll notice that they tend to be a little bit newer. So cluster 1 on average isn't all that much like older accounts on average compared to the other two clusters. So it's similar in interpretation, but not quite the same. And Ethereum is probably even arguably the most different. It's hard a bit to map this directly to what we were seeing in the previous data. So cluster 3, the blue group in this cluster, they're the ones with the oldest and the highest total USD. So they probably most likely could be mapped to what we used to call the OG swimmers. But then we see a little bit different of a pattern for some of the other groups. So for instance, the number of chains variable for, in this case, cluster 4 is actually higher than cluster 3, which is certainly not what we saw for the overall solution. So what this kind of tells you is that by chain, those interpretations that we provided for you may not hold quite as robustly. We might want to go through and spend some time interpreting the individual chain characteristics, with the possible exception of Polygon, since that matches so closely. We also looked at the total player traffic over time. And these plots are kind of interesting because if you look at that y-axis, we're sort of looking at the number of players, and it really shows you the sizable increase that was seen. And there's certain spikes that are really obvious, like on Polygon and the overall data around rounds 115 to 120, just a massive spike in terms of the player traffic. And then, overall, some players being lost, but lately maintaining upwards around the 15,000 number of players mark. We also did a little bit of analysis on the token holder network. So basically, what we plot in this network plot are tokens that are held by at least 1,000 players. And then we're coloring it by the chain. So you can see, like, depending on which chain it is. And then the links between the nodes are number of players that hold both tokens. So this is kind of interesting because it basically shows that ETH, Matic, BNB, etc., USDC, they're all popular cryptocurrencies that signal potential chains to explore and could be indicative of other pools that could be created that might have some success on the PoolTogether network. So we wanted to kind of close out by discussing some potential extensions of this work. We've come up with some, ideas that were basically a result of being inspired by some of the stuff that we already found, and this is what we came up with. Of course, the sky's the limit, and you may have your own ideas, so please pitch them. But these are kind of some ideas that we thought could be useful and interesting in terms of extensions to this work. Phase 2 of this analysis, what we basically saw was insight into how players behave, how their on-chain behaviors can be used to create profiles. What are some ways we could make this more useful? So number one, the data collection procedure could be automated. It could be formalized a little bit, documented a little better. That would allow this analysis to basically be like a living analysis that we'd be able to, in a sense, on demand, get updates to it as the data itself continues to be populated without needing to go through like extensive effort to redo the analysis. I think we're really close there, but the data collection backend needs a little bit more formalization in order to really achieve that. Another thing we were thinking about is basically analyzing the overlap between V4 players and those who purchased the Pooly NFT and donated to the Gitcoin grant for PoolTogether's legal defense, which in a way that would give us like a way to determine the platform's, I guess, strongest supporters. And there's a lot that can be done with that, you can imagine. We also thought about exploring, designing, deploying visualizations that are derived from Dr. CPU's data repository. You saw we already collected data and did some work on it, but there's a lot of rich data there, and there's a lot more we could do in terms of visualizations to continue this work. And then I wanted to kind of tease this a little bit because we actually were so interested that we got a little bit of a jump start on this, which is basically comparing the PoolTogether behavior analysis across the profiles we created. So rather than like we showed in this presentation across the chains, how about using those profiles that we've defined and comparing some characteristics of the behavior across those profiles? Not to bury the lead a little bit, but we actually took a first stab at that, and that's what you're seeing here. So you remember we looked at the churn rate as a function of time across the different chains. So we took that one step further, and we actually said, let's look at the churn rate as a function of time across the different clusters, the different profiles. And immediately you see something that kind of stands out, and the chart, there's a lot going on, but there's basically 4 lines for each of the 4 profiles that we talked about, and you can see that the pattern is by no means the same for all the profiles. There's some overlap, like for instance between rounds 230 and 240 you see a big spike. That spike is noticeable in all the different profiles, but especially so for the surfers and the OG swimmers. Meanwhile, look at about round 210, and you see the pool paddlers actually had one of their biggest spikes, and you don't observe that same pattern for the other profiles. So the takeaway here is kind of what you see in the last table at the bottom here. So we looked at just the last 25 rounds by profile. And what we found is that the different profiles we've identified exhibit a very different behavior in terms of the players that have been lost. So in particular, the pool paddlers, we see 371 players lost, but also 1,054 introduced in that time period. And meanwhile, in the surfers, you see almost as many that were lost. So 231, so about 60 or so percent of the pool paddlers, but a tiny fraction of the number introduced. What this is telling us is that these profiles really do capture differences in the behaviors of the players on this platform. And I think the hope here, and to be honest, we're really confident that this is the case, but the hope is that we will actually see, if we do this analysis by profile, we will get some really distinctive results across the profiles, which will both be interesting from the perspective of it will tell us that our profiles have meaning and interpretation and statistical validity, but it will also allow the people who have a vested interest and a stake in this platform to potentially target particular marketing activities, etc., at particular users based on what we're seeing in these profiles. So that was a little sneak peek, and we're really excited to potentially take this a step further. Thank you all for watching, and we're really excited and hopeful that we will see you in the next phase so we can continue some of this work. Thanks so much.